somehow naturally, through some process of osmosis, you're going to get the right policy outcome. That the policy settings are somehow, just by virtue of you doing the right thing and being a good business and having a good innovative idea is enough. And the reality is, unfortunately, that is not how government works. That is not how policy development works. It's how policy development should work. But unfortunately, the reality is that if you're not the voice at the table, someone else is that voice. And so what we're dubbing kind of the Australian way of us trying, and the Australian model, what we're trying to do is saying, okay, let's take a step back. How do you get the best policy outcome? You get the best policy outcome if you can force parts of government to sit down with parts of industry and say, all right, what are the legitimate concerns the government has? And some of the concerns are legitimate, right? There is taxation concerns, there's security concerns, and their industry say, okay, effectively it's about saying to government, you cannot say no to new ideas simply because it's all a little bit too hard. The natural reaction, it's a lot easier for them to say, we don't kind of get it, it's all a bit complicated, let's just not do it, right? And let's just say no and create a regulatory framework that effectively bans it. That's not good enough. And it's not good enough to go for industry to turn around and say, we don't need government and we're going to be outside of this and we're going to be independent of government and somehow believing that if you're not participating in setting a regulatory environment, that somehow government's going to go away. Now, I know there are people here and there is with any kind of community, and certainly a digital community, there's a kind of a libertarian element with people with different views. Look, if you want to make a political statement or an ideological statement, that's fine, but let's not kid yourselves. Unless you have the right regulatory framework and environment, you are not going to be able to attract the investment dollars, the venture capital. People aren't going to put their time and money if they don't believe the environment and the regulatory framework is going to give them some kind of protection or security. It is so risky putting money and investments into business anyway. Why would you do that in an area if they're not participating and they don't have the right regulatory environment and regulatory framework? So what we're saying is, okay, how we're trying to fix this is by forcing government and business to sit down together through a very, very open, collaborative process. We're going through a very public process of the Senate inquiry to actually force everyone to put their cards down, put up their legitimate concerns, give industry a way to respond, and hopefully, by keeping it bipartisan, by keeping it away from politics, but making it about the right policy, we're going to be able to create a framework that'll be a world first.
Can I play the devil's advocate here? Just on and I think you raised some excellent points, Senator. In the United States, sometimes laws are written very poorly, even after there's this kind of cooperative process between industry and the people who make the laws and the regulations. That's just the nature of the beast. In the U.S., we have, I think, as a society, especially as it relates to Bitcoin, we have decisions to make, and the decisions are basically: are we going to use the laws and the regulations that are already on the books to regulate in the Bitcoin space, or do we want to create more laws and more regulations? And it's a kind of, there's more to that question. Theoretically, we could allow this entire industry, the Bitcoin space, to be regulated under pre-existing money transmitting laws. And that kind of sucks, because it's an awkward fit. The laws that are in place they don't necessarily fit. But then we go through the experiment that we went through in the state of New York. And, well, we don't really like that either. And so it's a question, do we allow these pre-existing laws to apply and to govern, or do we write new ones with all these different people participating in the process? And sometimes it's a be careful what you wish for type of a scenario, because you could get something that's much, much worse than just allowing the laws that are already on the books to be the ones that govern. And I think that's a decision that we need to make here. And it's really, it's nothing new. There's nothing new about laws and regulations taking time to catch up to technological developments. There was a Supreme Court case in 1948 called McBoyle, where this guy named McBoyle had stolen an airplane and brought it over interstate lines somewhere in the Midwest. And he was prosecuted under a statute that criminalized stealing motor vehicles and bringing those into interstate commerce. And his defense at trial was, it's an airplane. It's not a motor vehicle. And he lost at trial. He lost on appeal. And they went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, you know what, you're right. It's not a motor vehicle. It's an airplane. But it's just another good example of, laws not necessarily catching up to the technology. And, it's also a good example of, sometimes we do need to ask these difficult questions about, do we really want more laws on the book? I mean, there's already 4,000 plus federal criminal statutes that exist. Do we need to create more laws, or do we want to try to work with the ones that are already there?
I'd love to address that. And that's why I think in Australia we're going down what we sort of term the self-regulatory model, whereby the Bitcoin community or the digital currency community in general is basically going 80, 90, 95% of the way there to create policy ourselves. We're basically engaging with government, and we're taking, I guess, government, and I think Sam will attest to this, is government's taking a common sense approach. We've got precedent set back in the 1990s with APCA, which is the Australian Payments Clearing Association, which was all the banks in Australia. They got together and basically said, this is the way payment processing is going to take place. We'll come up with the model, we'll come up with the infrastructure, and as long as it makes sense, then government ended up ticking it off. So that's where we're going down this path with government at the moment. It's not about them coming in and imposing new laws or trying to come up with a whole heap of different, policies or procedures that we have to enact, governed by government. It's policies and procedures that we're putting in place that actually make sense to help facilitate basically this industry.
Yeah, and look, touching on that too. Firstly, I love talking to my American friends about government, because there's like such a defeatist attitude about government, that I guess if I was part of this political system, I may feel some of that as well, that fundamentally it's all going to fail and it's all going to be terrible.
That's exactly how it's fundamentally going to fail, and it's all going to be terrible. I think you summarized that perfectly.
Such an attorney.
Look, here's where I come at it from. Firstly, to reiterate an earlier point, if you're not part of the discussion happens anyway. Right? It's not going to happen simply because you're not there. And secondly, you do address, your concern is sometimes there's unintended consequences of legislation, and you need to have a process that allows you to go back and fix those unintended consequences. You're definitely correct. You're definitely right. But the best way to get the best outcome is to actually bring the industry in early. And I guess the call to industry is industry has to be prepared to participate in that process early. But what you're talking about is a really live and real question. And there's money tied to this. Right? I mean, why would I want to invest? If I'm a serious, I'm not talking about kind of venture capital, angel money of 25, 50,000 for some startup. I'm talking about real, proper investment. So if I'm one of those superannuation funds in Australia, which we talked about before, $1.9 trillion of wealth is kept there. And I'm looking at serious investment and putting real money behind digital commerce and e-commerce and this kind of space. I want some assurances. Of course I do. I want to know that the regulatory environment is actually, of course things change and things will move around, but I'm not going to be making that kind of an investment, and I wouldn't be asking someone to be making that kind of investment if they go, but hang on, the laws, when they finally get written 6 months from now, may deem this entire thing illegal. And all our investments just vanished. And that's the real kind of challenge. And you're right, you're talking about, there's a chicken and the egg, there's a balance thing. I guess, and who knows, maybe this isn't the way to do it. But I guess our suggestion is, the best way of doing it is to get everyone in the table early.
Let me ask a question about the Australian Digital Currency Commerce Association, which is a nonprofit organization and representative for Australia, who it seems like has been successful in engaging government in Australia. And this is our mission here in the United States with the Chamber of Digital Commerce. How essential was the Australian Digital Currency Commerce Association in this process, and how important is it to have that nonprofit third-party advocate as a part of this process working with government?
Look, you have to have a
Says
peak body.
Perianne doing fundraising.
Yeah, no, but you have to
The
have a
price
peak
is
body.
down.
And by the way, Perianne,
Don't worry, so will be Perianne.
Perianne very kindly testified actually via hookup to my inquiry. And so she technically had, for a moment at least, parliamentary privilege under Australian law. So, look, you need it, right? And why do you need a peak body? Because government's time poor. And your issue is your issue and everyone else has their own issue, right? Like, something like digital currency, and it's very sexy at the moment, it's exciting, it gets a bit of media. There is a lot of political interest in all this, don't kid yourselves, right? You guys are in kind of, it's hot right now, right? And that means that there's an opportunity there to kind of reach out. It's new and exciting and innovative, and there's media interest, and there's all of those kinds of things that kind of create that kind of buzz and that energy, which people in the political processes gravitate towards. But, and this is kind of the big but, if you don't have a peak body, if you don't have someone to deal with, you're dealing with nobody. Right? At the end of the day, I mean, I'm not going to deal with 30 companies coming through the door, each of which purport to be speaking really for themselves, pushing their own barrow, when we're talking about what's the framework across the board. You know how much easier it is to actually have a settled framework and a settled view of industry? Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be unanimous, but a settled view of the industry so that when you're sitting down, you've actually got a partner to deal with. Otherwise, it becomes 30 companies trying to push their own, individual barrow, and that falls apart.
And before working with the Chamber of Digital Commerce, I worked on Capitol Hill in D.C., and I worked for a member of the Finance Committee in the House of Representatives. And I was a person that had to sit down and meet with all these lobbyists. And an issue that I would come across was you would have the lobbyists for Visa, the lobbyists for MasterCard, the lobbyists for American Express. They would all come in and they would all have their own side of the story. They would all point fingers. But at the end of the day, as somebody working in government and that's having to make decisions, where is your high quality source of non-biased information? And really what we're trying to offer is that source of information for those like Sam and for those in government who just want to know what's going on and get down to the facts.
I wouldn't say it's non-biased, because at the end of the day, you've got an agenda, right? And that's not a bad thing. You have the industry's agenda. But it's a lot easier dealing with one point. I mean, that's, of course.
So I've got a question, although first a comment. I mean, it's bad enough that you come out here and you point out that the regulatory people are the only ones wearing suits, which is so true. It's awful. And then the two of you with this Australian accent, everything you say sounds so interesting, and it's all true by definition, just because of how you sound. And then we're sitting here in between the two of you. It's really awful.
Tell me more about your first world problems.
Right, exactly. But I have a question. So I would say that the U.S. thinks of, I think everybody here thinks of the U.S. as probably the high watermark in regulation in digital currency. I mean, if you've satisfied yourself that you're going to be okay doing business in the U.S., you're probably okay doing business in a lot of other places. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there are a lot of jurisdictions that, quite frankly, a lot of U.S.-based businesses or businesses that could have been U.S.-based have left the U.S. for and have organized overseas. Isle of Man is one of the hot ones, du jour, because it's perceived as a friendlier regulatory environment. So as you think about shaping Australian policy on this subject, I can see maybe two competing imperatives defining the two ends of the spectrum. On the one hand, you could be thinking, well, we want to do everything we can within reason to make ourselves a very friendly jurisdiction, so we draw business in and we become a center of activity. And on the other hand, you could have the perspective of we just have to make sure it's safe, and we want to, first and foremost, take care of protecting, our Australians. So as you balance on the one hand, bringing in business, and on the other hand, having sort of effective regulation that protects consumers, what's your personal thinking about where you draw the line?
Okay, well, two things there. I think that's a really, really good point. Firstly, businesses don't actually do business in Luxembourg or Isle of Man or these places. They base themselves there for tax purposes. I mean, that really,
fair point.
And regulatory laws, right? But they don't really do business there. Here's the comparison I just want to kind of draw, right? And it's very kind of Australian perspective. We talk about the growth of Australia because of mining, right? The growth of Australian mining. I mean, the Australian economy, the reason why when everyone else in the world was going through GFC, we were doing so well economically was because of mining. Why? Now, I'm a Chinese company, right? And I'm one of the big Chinese companies, and I'm doing a big project out in, where the real growth area in China is at the moment, Western China, right? And I need to get iron ore. Now, I've got a whole lot of places that'll sell me iron ore. I can actually go to Africa and get iron ore. I can do a contract today with half a dozen different African nations, right? And that in 6 years' time, because it takes roughly 5-6 years from when you kind of agree to it to when stuff actually physically gets pulled out of the ground by the time it kind of gets overseas. 5-6 years. I mean, every project's different, but let's say 6 years, right? And I can probably do it on paper a lot cheaper. I can, right? I can do a deal right now with an African nation who'll give it to me cheaper on paper. Ends up costing a lot more. Why? Because there's no guarantee that the road to the mine will ever get built. There's no guarantee that there's not going to be some kind of a civil conflict that's going to mess things up. And I think the opportunity for countries like Australia in this space is it's not simply being the cheapest, because we'll always get outbid on tax and other things by other nations. It's about providing that level of certainty for business and having a certain business environment. Where we come at it from is our banking sector is just ferociously profitable. Right? I mean, the 4 big Australian banks last year had a profit of 29 billion Australian dollars, which is roughly 25 billion US, with a population, right, of 23 million people. I mean, they're the most profitable banks in the world.
And in the top 4 in the world.
Yeah. You talk about the kind of sovereign, all of this kind of, that environment exists and the regulatory environment exists. Why does it exist? Because we have very tight rules, tight restrictions, and that. And so, we're going to touch on another challenge because I know we're kind of talking here. Then you end up with this other challenge where the banking sector, and I'm sure you guys have all dealt with this if you've dealt with regulation in government, the banking sector's kind of always torn. Right? On one hand, they're smart enough to say, okay, is this an opportunity for us to make money? Is this the future? Is this PayPal? Should we get involved? Or they turn around and go, how do we shut it all down and stop it because it's cannibalizing our own business? And they're like internally torn, One day you'll get a submission from one bank that says, this is great, we want to participate, we want to be part of it. And another bank that turns around and says, this is death, this is funding ISIS, yada, yada, and kind of these common opposite extremes. Going back to the main point though, yes, it is about creating a regulatory environment that gives business certainty. And I think the opportunity for a place like Australia, just kind of very Australian hat, is that if we kind of get it right, that we end up attracting a lot of business that is, people like the people in this room who want to do serious business, who want to do proper business, and really, want to actually have a framework they can feel comfortable working in. And also, it's not a bad place to live. Does anyone have
any other questions or?
I've got a question for Kathy. I don't know if you're comfortable taking a position on this or not. There's a lot of debate about whether even at the federal level we would do better with new laws for digital currency, or whether there's enough clarity or at least enough of a framework under the existing laws that as there are enforcement actions and people get a better sense of how the law is going to be applied, that there isn't necessarily the need for new law. And it's like in so many other areas, it's going to be the development of the existing body of the law. Any thoughts on that subject?
I just think it's too early to tell. I think that, as court decisions come out too, let's not forget Congress is one body, the executive branch who's enforcing it is another. We've got the whole other branch of the judiciary. And as some of these cases come about, maybe the executive takes a position, like the Justice Department, that the court's saying, no, that's wrong, Justice Department, you guys have it wrong. And I think it's really too early at this stage to tell until that process runs its course as to whether or not new laws are needed. We're still looking at telecommunications, we're still working with telecommunications laws. I won't use an acronym, it's CALIA, Communications Assistance to Law Enforcement, that was passed, a really long time ago, and we're still looking at, do we need to update that to take into account things like the internet? So I think it's really just too early to say. So I don't have a prediction on that.
Does the Australian legal framework have a place where digital currency could be made to fit comfortably if the decision was not to do new lawmaking, or do you think you need to do something?
No, look, we have to do something. Well, if we do nothing, here's the problem, right? So the tax office turns around and goes, we don't know how to deal with this. Angus talked about putting a tax on. They treat it as a commodity. That ends up putting a 10% tax on every transaction, which ends up, obviously kind of killing the industry really, because there's a 10% tax on it. How do you, on top of every transaction, ends up kind of not working. So I think there became that requirement. I think you would end up in the Australian context having to do something, but it's a very look. It's a live debate, but again, the point that I keep coming back to is, I don't know if it's kind of good enough for government. And look, America's like such a mess with this stuff because every state's got its own regulations and rules, and which is both an opportunity and I think a real problem. So it doesn't seem to be. I've been trying to follow this for the past couple of months, and I can't quite get clarity of what the system here even is because it seems to vary so much from one place to another. But again, it all comes back down to, I think, investment. And unless government is giving some kind of clarity, I understand the worry that it might be the wrong kind of clarity, and that's why industry should be involved. But unless there's some kind of clarity, I mean, you guys have all seen this. Why would someone invest?
That's a good question. When we talk about this concept of Bitcoin, the air quotes, Bitcoin regulation in the U.S. at least, and I don't know how you guys are structuring it in Australia, but Bitcoin regulation is a little bit of a misnomer here because the thing itself, the Bitcoin itself, it's not really regulated. What's regulated is how we use it. Am I offering people investment opportunities that they can make in Bitcoin? Am I using Bitcoin as some sort of a commodity or a future? Am I money laundering using Bitcoin? Am I whatever else it might be using Bitcoin? It's those uses that we're regulating here. And if we're going to go about this process of creating laws, regulations for all of it, just the legislation process, the regulatory process itself is going to take a very, very long time. And that's not even to mention how we're going to go about implementing all of that and then having companies adapt. But I guess that's a question. How are you planning on strike that? How is Australia planning on structuring those regulations? Is it an issue of use, or are we talking about a regulation of the thing, the Bitcoin itself?
That's a very, very good question. And I think that's the process we're going through at the moment to try and identify how you do it, if you're going to do it, and what are the means by which you do it. Our process is probably pretty simple, though. I mean, the bit that I guess the opportunity is that maybe because the clarity of the kind of political system's a bit simpler, so it's kind of a bit. I mean, there's nothing as complicated as the US political system, which you can spend an entire life working in and still have no understanding how anything seems to work or apparently never work. But I mean, look, our system's pretty simple. We go through a Senate process. We have a public inquiry. People participate. Industry puts its case forward. Government puts its case forward. The issues hopefully are dealt with as part of that process. You come out with, at the end of it, an agreed set of recommendations. You keep the whole thing bipartisan, so you don't make it about the two major political parties. You make it about good policy. And then it ends up becoming this thing which we call non-controversial legislation, ideally, which means that it's legislation that's supported, because you get it unanimously through the committee process, it's supported by both major political parties, and then it's introduced. I mean, that's the perfect world, right? And then it gets introduced, and then within these laws, when you change things, you always give the government a little bit of a scope to amend things later. If you're always going to have teething problems in new legislation. But yeah, look, I mean, that's the process. In terms of what exactly it is and how you regulate, I mean, look, the industry's major concern is the taxation arrangements problem, and the tax office just kind of concerns that too. There's both legitimate and illegitimate security concerns. You know, some of the security stuff is legitimate. Some of it's, I think, a bit of scaremongering and a bit of lack of understanding. The point I guess I really want to stress is, I don't think some of these people in this room know so much about all of this. I think sometimes
looking at whether you want to talk about state, federal, or international, what do you think the big development is going to be on the regulatory front? And here's the challenge. We're going to go this way this time, and you can't repeat. We need new information on each of you. And let's be as specific as we can to communicate as much information as we can, as quickly as we can. So what do you see happening on the regulatory front this year, state, federal, international, that interests you, softball? Quick, good, deep answer.
Sure. For me, it's and I'm going to cherry pick the most popular one, and you guys are going to have to suffer the same consequences that I just did. The ever-expanding definition of money transmitter. As it relates to companies engaged in the virtual currency space. And that definition is being expanded seemingly on a notice-by-notice basis by FinCEN. The more companies that are kind of caught in that definition are being categorized as money transmitters are ultimately going to face a whole host of difficulties that traditional money transmitters have been dealing with for decades now. not the least of which is a total lack of access to reasonable banking services. So I think as that definition expands and the more categories of companies are caught up in it, it could make operating a Bitcoin-related business very, very difficult.
I think you get a pass on the rule that it has to be a new subject because you may have something to say about that.
I guess I would say that I think what's to come in 2015 is a lot also more guidance for companies, for individuals, and for the industry, not just in the form of regulations, but I had made the point earlier when we were backstage that sometimes government moves a lot more slowly, and I hear all the time people in the industry saying, we hear all of this stuff, when is anything coming? And sometimes cases or investigations or actions take years in the making because the government moves more slowly than the private industry. So just because something hasn't yet come out doesn't mean it's not in the works. So I think that the industry could look for some, and from some of the things that I think are going to come out publicly in 2015, I think they're going to provide a lot of guidance as to companies that I think will be very helpful, actually, in knowing what is or what is not, in the government's view anyway, permissible.
So, if anybody's generating a transcript, that's worth circling in red.
Yeah, absolutely. And building on top of that, and what you're saying is if government is moving more slow, the industry doesn't necessarily have clarity. Some of these laws and regulations that you might be looking at were written in the 30s or the 70s or even the 90s. How do they apply to these very innovative technology companies that are created in this day and age? And being able to interpret these laws and regulations into this industry can be extremely difficult and very risky. And at the Chamber, we understand the importance of getting compliance right to protect yourself if one of these enforcement actions come down the pipeline and somehow your company was somehow related to it. Understanding the difference between anti-money laundering compliance, knowing your customer, the Bank Secrecy Act, and OFAC. And how do those apply to today? And obviously, that seems like an interesting, companies have a lot of compliance that they have to undergo through, and they have to understand, and they have to spend a significant amount of resources to protect themselves. And being able to interpret these laws and regulations in today's day and age can be extremely difficult. And what I think some companies here that I've even spoken with of knowing, do you have to be registered as an MSB or do you not? And some people choose not to. And if you're not, what protections do you have? And your protection is your compliance program. So an initiative that we've taken at the Chamber of Digital Commerce is providing high quality resources so companies can understand and have high resources of putting these programs together. And building on what Andrew was saying about having access to financial services. Many companies in this space are having a lot of trouble gaining banking accounts, banking relationships. And we spent on Tuesday 5 hours at the Treasury meeting on financial access for MSBs. And just because some companies in the Bitcoin ecosystem are MSBs, all companies in the Bitcoin ecosystem are having this issue of getting bank accounts. And so what we're finding is that the banks and the regulators don't necessarily understand the industry either. So bringing more education on what these companies are, what they look like, and what rules and regulations apply to them are going to be extremely important and complicated.
So two things. One, do you think there's a change this coming year in access to banking? Do you see things getting better this year?
Well, we certainly put a stake on the ground on Tuesday when we stood up and we told the bank regulators that we're essentially being discriminated against because we're seeing residual effects from this MSB issue that's been ongoing for decades. So now the issue has at least been raised with the regulators, and now we can start that deeper dive of going into a lot of those education initiatives with the regulators and explaining to them, if you spend 5 minutes looking at the business plan of some of these companies, there's no way, shape, or form anybody would come to the conclusion they're an MSB. Why wouldn't you bank them?
Let me quickly translate acronym speak up here. MSB, money service business, and for most companies here in digital currency, the question is whether you're a money transmitter. There are several categories of money service businesses under federal law, money transmission being the most likely relevant one to what you guys are doing. And if you are a money transmitter, it means you have to register with FinCEN, which is the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which is the Department of Treasury agency that oversees U.S. anti-money laundering law, AML, another buzzword. And then you have a bunch of compliance obligations. Just to keep in your head that whether or not you're a federal MSB and you have to register is a distinct but related question to whether you're a money transmitter under the state statutes. And if you're a money transmitter under the definition of, under that definition of state, it's not just registration, unlike federal, you got to get a license, and that is a time-consuming and difficult process. Back to you, Marco.
I know Mo likes announcements at his events, so we'll do an announcement. It'll be fun. You've all heard of the Bit license, right? This is the world's first Bitcoin or digital currency specific regulation. In 2015, we will see, I'll be more specific, in the second or third quarter of 2015, we'll see the first genuine law, the first statute passed in the United States that is digital currency specific.
That's New York, you're saying?
No, this is a different state. Yeah,
What state?
I can't say.
It's an announcement or speculation?
No,
Yeah, I mean, you said announcement, but that doesn't sound like an
Did you
announcement
get
to
a new
me.
job?
I think you're looking for more info, but the best I can do is that 2015 we'll see our very first.
Can we go through the
very
list
first
of
law.
states alphabetically and you
Yeah,
say yes?
just
if
go.
we get it?
Warm,
Alabama,
cold.
California.
Arkansas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, so we've seen the first regulation, which was, as you see, it's promulgated by this notice and comment period. They publish guidance, and we comment on it, and then it's iterative, and they'll publish more guidance, and we'll see more guidance coming from New York really any day.
You're talking about New York now.
Now I'm talking about New York, but because Mo likes announcements, we'll make an announcement now that we're working on the very first Bitcoin law in the United States.
Can you say who we is?
No.
Okay. So here's what you've just heard from Marco.
Pseudo-anonymous, not anonymous.
New York is working on its bit license proceeding, which, by the way, is the proceeding to rewrite, to write a new, essentially, series of money transmission-like regulations that are specifically addressed to virtual currency companies. There's been a lot of question about when other states were going to get out of the gate with their own take on it, because basically all of the state money transmission statutes, were written 10, 20, 30 years ago to address things like Western Union, brick and mortar locations with, agents around the country, and barely take cognizance of the internet, much less digital currency. And nobody's really sure how any particular virtual currency activity does or doesn't really fit into any state statute.
Yeah,
so
and
that's the context. And so what Marco has just told you is some state is going to do something sometime this year that isn't New York.
But on the federal level, only 2% of laws ever proposed actually become law. So probably one of the hardest things to do in this world is get a law to go through.
I think that's absolutely right, and that's why we've seen the reaction that we've seen from the states. We've seen states like, there's obviously different approaches to this. We've seen New York say, look, we're not interested in interpreting our existing law. We're interested in passing, in creating new regulations that will have the force of law. We've seen states like Texas say, no, what we're going to do is interpret our existing law. Kansas did the same thing. Massachusetts has done something a little less official. And on the federal level, there's at this time, as far as I know, there's not much movement on the actual policymaking front.
You look poised to jump in.
I just wanted to ask, I don't know that you said it was a state. I mean, it could be states or it could be something other than a state.
It's
So I
a
think
state.
that's important.
It's a state.
So Marco has been now a little bit more specific. It is definitely a state. A state?
A state.
Okay, so we know it's one state. All right, you're up.
Being the fifth person here on a fairly heavy and heady topic, I think the one theme we've gotten so far is that the government is moving very slowly. And so let me be very practical in terms of my prediction as to where it's not truly regulation, but bear with me and you'll see where I'm going. I think what you're going to see in 2015 are going to be lawsuits. Lawsuits brought under consumer acts, what have you, where the lawyers are acting as private attorneys general to enforce these laws and to begin to clean out the corners of this industry. I've brought at least 2 of these lawsuits here in Florida. I've seen colleagues of mine also bring cases around the country. They all more or less look the same. Some of them are good.
What do those cases look like? I mean, can you give people a sense of specifically what you're thinking of and what kind of cases?
Sure.
you're
I mean,
talking
it can be as simple as a company claiming that they go on the Bitcoin forums and they promise that they're going to give certain returns on a mining project. And of course, that doesn't happen. On the flip side, someone says, I'm selling some mining product, and they don't deliver. Those are some of the more easier ones. There's a lawsuit, I'm in Palm Beach County, up in Palm Beach County, against an exchange. They're out there. And my concern is, and a practical takeaway, particularly for small and medium companies, I know you're hearing about federal government and all these acronyms that may sort of either scare you, but the reality is there's someone out there that you've taken some money from, and if they don't get what they want, they're going to go get a lawyer. And you need to listen to what these folks are saying, and if you don't understand it, find someone who can explain it to you like a lawyer, because what is going to happen is a lawsuit's going to show up, and then you're going to have to defend yourself, and then even if you do okay on that, someone like Kathryn's going to show up, and then you're going to have to deal with the federal or even the state agencies looking at you from that end. So this stuff is very, very scary. If you don't understand it, you need to begin to understand it. And I know that's not something you packed into your startup concept.
So we only have a few minutes left in the last question. I'm not sure we'll get all the way through it. Is, what are practical takeaways? And Kathryn, I want to start with you because I think of all us, you got a bunch of lawyers and an association person. You are the government, right? So, as much by way of practical advice you can give to people, I think it'd be very valuable.
I think one of the most practical takeaways is we always hear there's kind of a myopic focus on, am I an MSB, am I not an MSB, am I a money transmitter, am I not? And one thing that I think people should keep in mind is that regardless of whether you are or not, there are money laundering statutes that apply to every person and every company, and it does not matter whether or not you're an MSB or a money transmitter. And what matters is, if you had willful blindness or, in fact, knowledge that there was any illegal proceeds or activities, it does not matter what your status is. So I think that's something that the industry also needs to keep in mind is putting aside, let's say that you're not an MSB, and we can all agree on that. Have you exhibited any kind of willful blindness and you haven't had any kind of compliance program along the way? That's problematic. I'd also say that the agencies do collaborate. There's not, our office in the Justice Department collaborates with FinCEN on any number of cases. I can call up FinCEN and say, hey, here's what I'm looking at. What do you think? Do you have a case open? They often will join my cases, or they'll call me and ask me if I'm interested in joining their cases. So there is, I think you could look to greater collaboration at the federal government level.
So your best protection as a company is to have a compliance program, no matter what. And if any of y'all need help figuring that out, we have some resources available to the general public on that.
So I think there's some machinations. I think we're going to change up the program a little bit here and combine this panel with the next. Yes? Yes? Are we ready? Are you going to do an introduction? Let's do it. Yeah.
So it's like the 7th season of a show where they just start adding more and more characters, to keep it alive. This is like Mo's version of the Letterman couch. So look, I'm going to just talk a little bit. Angus and I are actually going to talk a little bit about what's happening in Australia on the regulatory front, and I'd be interested in getting a bit of feedback and to kind of join and participate in the discussion. For those of you who I haven't had the chance to meet, my name's Sam Dastiari. I'm a senator representing the largest state in Australia, New South Wales, in the federal parliament. And on the 2nd of October last year, I walked onto the floor of the Senate holding 2 bits of paper. In my left hand was a motion that we were going to create and conduct the most extensive, detailed investigation of digital currency, Bitcoin, and e-commerce conducted in the Southern Hemisphere. And in the right hand, I was holding a press release that I was going to issue as soon as I'd done that. And as I'm walking, and you've got to understand, this is kind of a big idea for a place like Australia, because you go, yes, we're the 12th largest economy in the world, but, it's a sparsely populated country, 23 million people, and we've tended to things like on fronts like regulation, rather than saying, how are we the people who can go out and do it first? We've always kind of waited to see what others are doing and kind of tended to follow some of those trends. So as I'm walking onto the floor of the Senate, one of the older senators pulls me aside and kind of pulls me into the corner. And this is a very distinguished senator. I mean, this is someone who, when they first got elected to the Australian Senate, fax machines weren't available. Right? I mean, this is how old we're talking about. And they pull me aside and they go, "Oh, Senator, I've been told that I'm voting for your motion." And I quickly run down the list, and their name's on the list, and it's a yes, so it's good. Yes, you are voting for my motion, thank God. Right? And they go, "But why on earth are we doing this inquiry?" And I think to myself, all right, so I start kind of running through my head all the arguments, it's a new area, there's an opportunity, I've got to do this and that. They go, no. Why are we doing this inquiry? The coin bits, when they make coins, don't they just recycle all the coin bits? Why on earth do we need to spend all this money doing a 6-month inquiry into it? And that kind of made me realize just the enormity of some of the challenge that we have. In August last year, the Australian Tax Office actually came to us and threw their hands in the air and said, we have no idea how to deal with this. The Australian tax code, like most Western tax codes, was written before the advent of the internet. Right? So they actually said to us, Bitcoin, they literally brought in a copy of the dictionary and said, it's not even in the dictionary. We don't know how to deal with this. And it's not good enough to simply say it's a regulatory problem alone. What they're saying, this is a policy decision for government. We need government to tell us, how do we deal with all of this? And so we started a process, and Angus is going to talk about it from the Industry Association, to say, okay, how do we start dealing with some of this? How do we meet some of these challenges? And how do we turn around and say, okay, is there another way where we can actually get industry and government to sit down together and work through a process? And the Treasurer, who's like the Chancellor of the Exchequer, if you're a kind of Canadian or a Brit, or a Treasury Secretary, I think would be the American, was incredibly supportive and said, let's try and find a way through. Let's do it in a bipartisan way. As I'm the chair of the Senate Economics Committee, kind of fell on my lap, and I started getting involved in what was obviously a very new area, but a very exciting area.
Oh, thanks, Sam. Just a brief introduction on who I am. I'm Angus Woods. My background is very much in retail banking and investment banking. I was a CFO of one of Richard Branson's many companies across the globe, Virgin Money down in Australia. And I now run my own financial services consultancy company. But what got me interested in Bitcoin, I guess it went back to 5-6 years ago, I believe it was, when Richard actually went and bought a company called Circle Lending here in the States, which was a family and friends lending, this peer-to-peer lending company. And that's when I got fascinated with this whole concept of the collaborative consumption economy. And now, obviously, and I think that's what the internet was intended to do 20 years ago, and we're now working out what the internet actually does for us as a global community. You've got Lending Club here in the States. You've got Uber, and it's called UberX, car sharing down here, down in Australia. So where do I fit in from a Bitcoin perspective? I think that's probably the most ambitious peer-to-peer project that we've got at the moment going on around the globe, is this peer-to-peer currency. So where do I fit in at the moment? I'm currently the treasurer of the Australian Digital Currency Commerce Association, or we refer to it as ADCA. We're probably Australia's preeminent association representing digital assets, digital currencies and blockchain technologies in Australia. Now, I've got to read this. The actual organisation's founding mandate is intended to act as the essential connection between merchants, industry, governments, regulators, financial institutions, and influential policy forums which give direction to this emerging industry, both at home and abroad. I'm also an advisor to a small specialist Bitcoin exchange in Australia. They've probably turned over about $30 million in Bitcoins in less than 18 months. So pretty impressive. 5 guys and 5 laptops, started it 18 months ago, and seeking advice from some of the old hats in the industry. So to Sam's point, when the Australian Tax Office concluded that they did not know exactly what digital currency was, they did what most tax collectors would do. They basically slapped a tax on it. So today I think Sam and I are going to tell you both sides of the same story. I'm going to talk about how the industry association has been working closely with government to create a formal partnership and take a progressive approach to this revolutionary technology. So shortly after the Australian Tax Office publicly shrugged its shoulders about what to do with Bitcoin, we decided to engage with government about seeking their assistance. We were looking for support to help us avoid the looming tax penalties that would make transacting on Bitcoin much more expensive, but also to improve the perception and reputation of Bitcoin among the public. We were very, very, very clear with government. We wanted our members to do business in Australia. So Sam, as chair of the Economics Committee, was very receptive to our inquiries, agreeing to meet with us. We asked him probably many of the questions that you've asked yourselves of your governments, i.e. who influences government's decision-making? How could we get these people to share the concerns of this industry? And how could we make our concerns a priority?
Look, I just want to point out too, I think it's fantastic that I've been here all day and the only panel in which everyone chose to wear a suit was the government regulation panel. So, go figure. But look, tiny bit about context. Australia, the Australian economy has been going incredibly well. 23 years of uninterrupted economic growth. You're looking at a sovereign wealth fund through our superannuation scheme that's currently $1.9 trillion. It's going to be $6 trillion in 20 years. And the Australian economy has really been growing on the back of the growth in China. You know, people give you some stories and they say, oh, you look out of a skyscraper in Shanghai and you see 1,000 cranes. Well, there's 1,000 cranes building 1,000 buildings, the resources of which were pulled out of the ground somewhere in Australia. The mining boom was an incredible opportunity. On top of that, you cannot travel through the Middle East and not be consuming Australian beef or Australian wheat or one of half a dozen different kind of agricultural products. But we kind of get it, that if you want to be a successful economy, you have to be diversified and you have to be tapping into new, innovative areas. And it's not good enough simply to rest on your laurels of being a mining and agricultural nation and actually not be able to engage with these new looming areas. And there's a myth that I kind of want to dispel here. There is this misconception amongst a lot of industry, particularly digital commerce, that somehow if you have a good idea and good intent...
Boring & Company's Perianne Boring, Nesnoff and Miltenberg's Marco Santori, Ackerman LLP's Christopher Hopkins, Forrest Littleman, Jacob, David and Joseph, Andrew Ittleman, and then Assistant United States Attorney, Organized Crime Strike Force, Kathryn Haun, and our moderator will be Jacob Farber from Perkins Coie. Please give them a warm welcome.
I was looking at the leather couch. It looked awesome.
All right, so this is a 30-minute regulatory panel, and we've been read the Riot Act by Mo to 1, keep it to 30 minutes, 2, to be really interesting and not another dull regulatory panel, and 3, to dive deep. You'll get 1, maybe 2 of those. Hopefully we won't bore you. We're going to jump right into it. I'm Jacob Farber. I'm at Perkins Coie. I'm going to kick it off by asking a general question of everybody, and as they answer it, I'm going to ask them to just briefly say who they are so you'll know why they're saying what they're saying. Take my word for it, it's a bunch of really impressive people. And I'm going right now. So the first question for the panel is, it's a new year, a lot happened last year, but there's still so much that's open-ended in the legal and regulatory framework, and what I want to know is the thing that worries you the most, either for your clients or if you're government, in terms of conduct in the industry, and kind of keeps you up at night. Go.
Good afternoon. I'm Christopher Hopkins. I am a lawyer with Ackerman, and my work in this space involves, I've represented ATM getting registered and licensed. I've worked with an altcoin getting developed in their terms and services. I also bring lawsuits against people who commit fraud in the digital space. As far as what I think is important for the next year has to do with definitions or labels. I've heard a lot today, and I'm reading a lot about Bitcoin 2.0 and this idea of moving away from the idea of currency and moving towards it being a token or access or something like that. As far as regulation is concerned, and there's been advisories on this, how you label what you're doing isn't really what's important. The mechanics of things aren't really what's important. What's important is where is the money going and what's the intention of it and who's getting a profit. So when I see people writing terms of service and their product doesn't match it, or they update it but they don't change their definitions, or if they set definitions and they completely disregard them, or they post stuff on Twitter and Facebook that's inconsistent with what they're doing, that's where people are going to get in trouble in the past and certainly going forward.
My name is Marco Santori. I'm with Pillsbury Winthrop in New York City. I also chair the Bitcoin Foundation's Regulatory Affairs Committee. I represent companies in the space, a few of you in the audience today, exchanges, payment processors, and more Bitcoin 2.0 stuff. And the question was, what do we fear most about 2015?
Yeah.
What
Nice and
develops do we fear most?
specifically.
So yeah, specifically, look, in the last quarter, I've met with what Treasury, main Treasury, FinCEN, SEC, CIA, CFTC, CFPB. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. But what worries me is the battle that is only beginning now, and that's the fight over jurisdiction. What regulatory agency is going to claim jurisdiction over what part of the industry? If you're a Bitcoin company and you're an exchange, there's a prospect right now that you're going to be regulated by 7 different agencies. That's just on the federal level, and I think that there's going to be some casualties of that. And so obviously, the advice that I give and that I've always given is to be proactive. Reach out to the regulators. Start reaching out to policymakers, because that's the next frontier. Don't just sit back and wait for the reticle to fall upon you. It's a bad plan.
Hi, my name's Perianne, and I'm the president of the Chamber of Digital Commerce. We are located in Washington, D.C., and our mission is to advocate for the digital currency, digital asset community in Washington to public policymakers and help facilitate this dialogue that Marco is talking about between the industry and between regulators. And I agree with a lot of what Marco is saying, is that you have many different agencies who all have their own agendas that want jurisdiction, and everybody has their own political agenda. The problem is who's coordinating that process? And as someone who used to work on Capitol Hill and had to deal with this, a lot of agencies, they don't talk to each other. So it's extremely important that you have industry representation on the ground in DC that's helping bring coordination through all the different rules and regulations. That way companies aren't saddled down with a huge list of burdensome regulations that nobody in their, even with a reasonable, attempt could be able to bring, could do it in an affordable way and still run a company. And as everybody here in this industry is pretty much a startup, everybody has their own, resources that they have to deal with. And another issue that I think is extremely important is also the perception and the reputation and the public perception of this industry. We have seen many public scandals that have brought a very negative connotation to the industry in Washington, D.C. And as somebody that's on the ground in D.C. and has conversations with regulators on a regular basis, when you say Bitcoin, they're automatically thinking drug dealers, and they think Silk Road, they think Mt. Gox. So it's extremely important that we're protecting the reputation of the industry as well, and that companies in this space, whether you are a software provider, an exchange, an MSB, money service business, promise we wouldn't use acronyms here, it's important that you protect yourself. That way, if something does come down the pipeline that Katie might see, your company is not legally exposed and jeopardizing the entire reputation of the entire industry.
So in 25 words or less, what do you worry about coming up this year the most? I want a concrete statement.
Having enforcement actions come down the pipeline and having a company's name that's associated with Bitcoin facilitating something terrible and it ruining and further dampening the reputation. So, having the public perception is extremely important. And when you have media hype on top of that, it makes the issue so much more difficult to deal with.
That's a good answer and a good seg.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Katie Haun. I'm a federal criminal prosecutor. I'm based in San Francisco. I've been a prosecutor for over almost a decade. I was in Washington, D.C. before for 9 years. And I spend now approximately 90% of my time working on digital currency and crime. So I'm very focused on that, sitting in San Francisco. And I think the thing that I worry most about, having a very different perspective, is that some really bad actors are going to use mobile payments or digital currency in a way to accomplish a really bad thing that everyone in this room would think is very bad. I don't think that's particularly funny, but in a way that makes it untraceable or unstoppable by using technology such as tumbling services or mixing services. So in a way that really makes that not amenable to law enforcement. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So the question is what I'm anticipating in 2015?
Well, we're going to talk about positive developments next and what we think is coming up. I'm trying to give people a sense of what are the big clouds right now.
Right. So I'm Andrew Ittleman. I'm an attorney with First Ittleman, David & Joseph. We're here in Miami. We provide comprehensive representation to highly regulated businesses. So we do a lot in the Bitcoin space and other areas where businesses are under a lot of scrutiny by federal and state governments. I'm the last in line here, and a lot of people have addressed issues that I think are important. I think the IRS notice that came out during the second quarter of 2014 is an important one, especially as it relates to mining companies. The position that was articulated by the IRS was it was a shot across the bow for the whole industry, specifically as it relates to mining companies. If their position is going to be tested through audits and then ultimately in tax court litigation, it could theoretically make mining, especially in the United States, completely unprofitable, worse than it is now. And that could...
Can you explain why that is?
Sure. So if you mine gold or you mine ore, when you chip that piece of gold out of the wall of the cave, it's not a taxable event. There's no taxation, there's no taxable event that occurs there until you actually sell it. And all of the expenses, all the money that goes into the mining process for the gold miners, they get the benefit of those deductions. With Bitcoin, it's different. With Bitcoin, when you mine Bitcoin, there's a taxable event the moment you mine it, and that taxable event is a serious one because miners, at least according to the IRS's notice, are being taxed at an ordinary rate. And so when you add all of the power costs and the fluctuation in the power costs and the fluctuation in the price of the virtual currencies to that very serious taxable treatment, that negative taxable treatment, theoretically you could be turning miners away. And ultimately that could damage the Bitcoin ecosystem worse than anything else that we have here. So again, the IRS's position in that notice is just a notice. This is their current thinking on the subject. But I expect that will be tested. I think a mining company will be audited, and I think that audit is going to turn into tax court litigation, and the lawfulness, the constitutionality of the IRS's position is going to be tested in court. It may start to happen this year, we'll see. But I think that's a huge development to come.
So keeping in mind the three principles of be quick, go deep, and be entertaining, my phone is ringing. The next question for everybody, and it's really an opportunity, you each have a substantive area that we need to dig into, and I want you to use it, is over the next year, and
Other people, especially government, know none of it. And there's a really kind of like a responsibility, I think, on behalf of the industry to actually share some of that information and go through kind of a learning process. Like, look, I didn't know any of this 3 months ago. Right? I'm going through this huge learning process myself. And I think that's kind of what, I think that's what good government should do, but I think also incumbent on industry to reach out to do that.
So I just got the hook signal from Mo, so we just have a minute or two to finish up. And Kathy, I know that you kind of were leaning forward, waiting to make a comment. So I think you may take us out.
Yeah, I was just going.
Well, let's hear from her first.
Yes, I think I was going to say it would be interesting to just live with the regulations, just listening to Sam, to live with the regulations a little bit, because who knows how the technology is going to change in 3 months, in 6 months, in a year. So there is some sense, I think, that you pass new laws and regulations and then they're outdated in 2 years' time.
That's right.
I think that's a key thought. Stuff happens so fast in Bitcoin and in digital currency and blockchain technology. I mean, it's, a month is like a year. And when you're talking to the regulators, and it's really complicated in it too. And by the time a regulator gets a good understanding, not because they're dumb, there are a lot of really competent, thoughtful people working hard in government to understand it, they've understood it the way it looked 6 months ago because it's been evolving since. And then by the time you regulate or legislate, there's another 6 month or a year delay to get something promulgated. So you're aiming regulation at what it looked like 18 months ago. And it's one of the great things about digital currency and blockchain technology is how fast it moves. It also makes it really hard to talk about how you regulate it because it's such a moving target right now.
I think that's going to be the importance for Perianne's group, is to make sure that education is funneling through one organisation here in the US. Like we engaged with 30 government bodies in the lead up to, obviously, the Senate inquiry, to the point where the Australian Crime Commission in Australia were actually quite supportive of what blockchain and Bitcoin could actually do for them down the track. Now, I'm not sure where you guys are at with your Australian Crime Commission equivalent, or even with the AFP, the Australian Federal Police, and your FBI. But we've made a concerted effort over the last 12 months to make sure that education process is continuous. And it's coming along the way, and I think that's important.
I want to thank the panel and our Australian friends and guests. Thank you guys so much for coming out and letting us be on the stage along with you. Thank you guys for listening. I hope we made it as interesting as we could.
Thank you. Did you guys fly in just for this?
For some VC talks.
Nice. Great. Perfect.
Thanks, mate. That's great. I ended up going over there in the end anyway.
Thanks, man. That's great.